There's a story out of Poland. The Polish parliament has voted overwhelmingly against a bill that would have created a near total ban on abortions. So there was a vote this morning that the vote was against. There was 352 to 58. They voted overwhelmingly against that bill that would have created a near total ban on abortions. Here's the details. So Poland is currently run by a socially conservative party called the Law and Justice Party. The bill was initially introduced. The members of parliament from the party supported it. It was initially backed. Here's the key thing. It was initially backed by the Catholic Church. But the bishops later backtracked and said that they could not support one of the proposals, which was to jail women who had an abortion. All right. So there's some things that we I don't know that we take it for granted here in the United States, but I think we run the risk of taking it for granted and having ourselves backpedal into these types of conditions where we're actually talking about sending people to jail over having an abortion. In fact, one of our presidential candidates even mentioned that and he, whatever context you want to say it, in context, he said that there should be some type of penalty for people who have abortions. He later backpedaled and took it back. But his gut instinct was to say this because he was pandering to the evangelical vote. So we kind of take it for granted and think that these things are not possible here. But I don't think that we can rest on our laurels. But again, so in Poland, this was backed by the Conservative Party as well as the religious institution. And anytime you get this marriage between conservative values, religious institutions, and the Conservative Party, you have an affront to individuals' rights, particularly when it comes to social issues, specifically dealing with quote unquote sexual morality and the church's and religion's definition of sexual morality. In other words, people want religious figures and religious politicians and conservative politicians want to legislate your sexual morality. This is as old as time almost. I mean, this is almost the a foundation of almost every single religion. It has been in huge part about controlling the sexual behavior of everyone, but women in specific, right? It's about controlling what women do with their bodies, and not just controlling what they do with their bodies, but in my opinion, as I read and understand the context of these rules, of these laws and these positions and these doctrines, it's often not about just controlling women's decisions, but controlling those decisions to the benefit of the men who are usually making the rules. In other words, you have men who want to control the sexual behavior of women for their own personal pleasure. And you see this through history, and it's still here today. It's still about dictating to people how we think they should behave sexually. Because ultimately, it's of course they're going to make, it's a conversation about the life of a child, right? Or the life of a fetus. That's just the front end of the conversation. If you unpack that with anyone and you dig a little bit deeper, you realize it's much more than about whether or not a woman carries a baby to term and gives birth to that child, right? It's really about whether or not the woman has the power to make this decision for herself. And this is what we see religion doing to women throughout history, but particularly when religion joins up with politics. And this is exactly what we see in Poland. And so this law that they rejected, right? It's a good thing that they rejected it. But the question is, why did it ever make its way to the table in the first place? right? Why is this something? Why are we even entertaining the idea that a woman should be punished and sent to jail over abortions? And keep in mind, now in Poland, abortions are already largely banned in Poland, right? There's already a penalty to be for a doctor who performs an abortion. This law was going to go above and beyond that and penalize and criminalize a woman who gets an abortion. So it's amazing that this is something that almost became like, I know it failed, and I'm super glad that it failed, but the fact that it got that close, it came to a vote, right? It came to a vote. And had the protests that we'll talk about not ensued, had the bishops not backtracked, right? The bishops backtracked once they realized, oh, this is going to criminalize, this is going to put women in jail. So the bishops of the Catholic Church, they backtracked. But had they not, there's a possibility that this could have passed in Poland. Again, to draw a parallel here in the United States, don't think for a second that there aren't a group of politically influential people, not just the nut jobs, but the people with political power, politicians like Mike Pence. Don't think for a second that they would not desire to criminalize abortions, not just make them more difficult. Like in Texas, you have to drive how many hours? I think 2 or 3 hours to find a clinic where you can get an abortion. They don't want to just make it more difficult. They want to criminalize it. So in Poland, there were protests. They were protesting this vote. They were protesting this potential legislation, and tens of thousands of women protested. They protested against the law. As many as 24,000 women skipped work to protest this on Monday in Warsaw. Protesters waved black flags to draw attention. On social media, tens of thousands of Poles had posted pictures online in support of the protest, in opposition to this legislation. And this was the thing that stood out the most to me. It wasn't just the women, but the women got support, overwhelming support from official organizations, the Polish employers, including restaurant owners, gallery owners, directors, universities, mayors. They got overwhelming support from their community, and they were able to put this law to bed and put it down. So kudos to the people who took action there, and just kind of wake us up here in the States, because there are still people who would love to take us back to a time where abortions were illegal and where abortions were being performed in back alleys and women were dying. And not just that realistic but dramatic picture of it, but to a time where women did not have that control and that say so over their own body. Now, there's still the underlying conversation that that this is still a political football here in the United States. Here's the thing, and I've said this, I don't think I've talked about this in quite some time, but here's the reality. I think according to the Guttmacher Institute, but 65% of all abortions are performed on patients who identify as Christian, either Catholic or evangelical, mainline Protestant. 65%. The biggest push against a woman's right to choose comes from the evangelical and the Catholic churches. My thing is this. Twofold. One, if you've got a problem with the number of abortions being performed in America, wouldn't it behoove you to address your congregants? Because if 65% of the people in America, and of course, I think there's the majority of people in America who identify as Christians. I don't have those numbers handy, but I mean, of course, you're going to expect a large number of them to be Christian. however they are a Christian, and they're sitting in somebody's church on somebody's Sunday, wouldn't it be, I mean, instead of trying to use the political system to fix your shortcomings in your church, why not just preach it in your church and let the political system do what it's supposed to do, which is to neither serve church nor hinder church? Just let politics be agnostic and you preach what you want to preach in your church. Because, I mean, imagine if we reduced abortions by the 65% of Christians who get them. I mean, wouldn't that be one of the greatest victories for the people who are running around for the right to life, the right to lifers? That would be a tremendous victory. So number one, start at home, start in your churches. Number two, why not address the overwhelming issues that lead women to these types of difficult decisions in the first place, right? We have all of the concern in the world for a child before it's born and have zero concern for him or her after that child is born. And we have zero concern about the economic conditions. And I don't want to throw the wrong stat out there, but I would say it's like a plurality of the reason people make this decision. The plurality is an economic decision. It's an economic decision. And it's not what you think. If you look at the most recent data, it's usually married couples, middle-aged married couples who have to make this difficult type of decision. And that decision is usually predicated on their economics. So instead of addressing the reasons why so many abortions are performed in America, we don't want to talk about that. Let's just outlaw it. Let's just make it illegal. Because we can't teach our own congregation, right? Our own congregation's not listening to us. So then, hell, let's go and get the government to do what we can't do in our own church. And no matter how logical that argument just was, you're going to have people who fill up the comment section on this particular clip and say, "Oh, you want to just, you want to kill babies." Like you would be amazed. Go back and look at any of the videos that I've done about a woman's right to choose in the context of the religious argument against it and the illogical arguments against it. And you will see that no matter how much you explain this to people, they who are right to lifers, they just completely ignore the logic and completely operate on the emotion of it. And it reminds me of, and then we'll move on to another story, but it reminds me of when I was a grad assistant at a school in Florida, at a university in Florida. And I was walking to class to take care of the class for the professor that day. And there was a right to life protest outside. And right to life protest. And they had all these huge banners, huge posters of unborn fetuses, the aborted fetuses, and just gruesome graphic images. And like the posters stood at least, I would say, I'm only 5'6", so they were at least 12 feet tall, right? They were huge, and they had about 10 of them. But then at the end of it, they had a picture of the Obama family, and they laid the blame of the entire conversation about abortions at the feet of President Obama vis-a-vis the Democratic Party, and basically saying that the Republican Party is the option for people who want to, quote unquote, end abortions. And when I engage, because I decided, I'm like, all right, let's talk to these people. When I engage in the conversation with them, and we started to unpack all of the fallacies that surround that assumption, right? The fact that the reason people are opting to have abortions, or even the fact that the rate of abortions were higher during George W. Bush's term, right? And so here's the other thing, and the fact that there was a period during George W. Bush's term that they had both the House, the Senate, the presidency, and a majority conservative bench. And they did absolutely nothing for the right to lifers. So here I am explaining to them their own issue, that you want to politicize this and use this as a political football to help elect Republicans, yet and still the Republican Party has done nothing for you on this. And to make that worse, to add insult to injury, the rate of abortions were higher underneath George W. Bush than the previous years, than I believe underneath Bill Clinton. Did any of that matter? No, none of it mattered. You know why? Because it's not an intellectual conversation. It's not a logical position. It's not an intellectual position nor a logical position. It is a political position. So much of the right to life movement is 100% political. And if they were really concerned about the lives of unborn children, then they would help address the issues that lead families and women to have to make these difficult decisions in the first place. But they're not going to do that. They're not going to do that because they aren't really concerned about the life of the child after it's born. They're only concerned about the emotional capital that they can collect on these conversations. Every 4 years, they can collect on it and take it to the polls.